move into our sermon here. I got to tell you, I'm not one of those people that listens to music when I'm driving to work and back. I'm one of those crazy people that listens to audiobooks and lectures and the like. And so this is the first time my singing lungs have had practice in 8 weeks, and they feel it pretty good. Some of you probably sing all the time, so this is pretty normal for you anyway, but I'm not a singer. And so I'm kind of feeling a little bit, but I'm ready to preach. Oh, it feels good to see you here again today. It's weird preaching to an empty room.
But we're glad we did.
Yeah.
What?
And we were with you in spirit anyway.
I'm glad I was able to. As we've gone through this, as a historian, I've often thought how blessed we are to live in an age where electronics allow us to sit at home and watch a pastor, whereas 100 years ago during the Spanish flu, when churches closed, they just simply had to say, worship at home with your families and we'll see you when it's over. And I'm very grateful that I'm able to keep connection with all of you in that way. Whew. All right, so I do want to ask this question. If you've been to Washington, D.C., would you raise your hand? I remember going to Washington, D.C. with my family on vacation when I was a teenager for the first time, with my mom and my brother and my sister. And if you've never been there before, the first time you go, there's this deep sense of awe as you walk around and you see the different monuments and memorials to the people who you grow up hearing stories about in school or in books you read about George Washington and Abraham Lincoln and Thomas Jefferson. And to see statues and monuments that are larger than life that you hear about, it's something that can really take your breath away. And one of the things I've thought about ever since is I've wondered, especially as someone who loves to study history, what would it be like to meet these people for real? What would it be like to meet George Washington or Abraham Lincoln in person? I would imagine with George Washington it would be kind of odd when he smiles and you realize he really does have wooden teeth. Now, the reason I brought this up this morning is because, did you know the Jews had their own founding fathers and great historical leaders that they look to in much the same way that we look back to Abraham Lincoln and George Washington and the founding fathers? They had the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They had Moses and David and Elijah and Isaiah and all of these important figures from the past that, just like George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, are part of the American idea of what it means to be a good American. These great Jewish leaders were part of their national identity of what it meant to be a good Jew. And they grew up hearing stories about these men. And a few women as well. Ruth, Esther, Jael. I'll let you go look that one up on your own because we have kids here. I won't tell you the story of what she did. But it was pretty bloody and violent. So now some of the kids are like, darn, I would like to hear that one. But what would it be like to be a first century Jew like Jesus or Peter or James or John and to actually meet the heroes of the faith in person? Well, guess what? Today we're going to see what happens when they actually get to meet two of their heroes. We're going to be looking at the story of the transfiguration of Jesus. This is found in Mark chapter 9. So we're heading back into Mark. The last time we were here back before Easter, we were in chapter 8. And what had happened back in chapter 8 as Jesus had taken the disciples outside of Israel into Gentile territory up into Caesarea Philippi. And while they were up there, Jesus asked them, "Who do you think I am?" And Peter responds by saying, "You are the Christ. You're the Messiah, the Son of God." And once this cat is out of the bag, so to speak, and the disciples are really full into his identity as the Messiah, he starts to tell them what that really means, and they can't accept it. He says, the Messiah is supposed to suffer and die for the sins of the nation, for the sins of the world. And Peter even takes him aside and rebukes him and says, "You've got to stop saying these things." And we finish with the famous passage where Peter is crushed when Jesus turns his back on him and says, "Get behind me, Satan." So that is the context for where we are at today. What we're going to be reading today takes place 6 days after that eventful episode. We'll be starting in verse 2, and it goes like this. I'll read the first couple verses here. After 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him and led them up to a high mountain where they were all alone. There he was transfigured before them. His clothes became dazzling white, whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them. And there appeared before them Elijah and Moses, who were talking with Jesus. So like I said, this is 6 days later. They probably come back down into Galilee. If they were walking fast enough, they probably could have even made it into Judea or close to Jerusalem, but Jesus never really moved that fast. And so they're probably in Galilee somewhere. And we often think of the 12 as the most close-knit group that Jesus has, but the truth is inside the 12 there's another group, the group of the three, the inner circle of Jesus. Peter, James, and John. And what you'll find, especially going from here on out, Jesus will spend extra time with these three disciples that he doesn't spend with the others. Now, I think sometimes we can be tempted to look at that and think, well, they're getting special treatment because they're good listeners. But if you've ever spent any time in the classroom, you know that there are two kinds of kids that teachers hold close to them. Sometimes it's the kids who are really good listeners, but sometimes it's the kids who need an extra watchful eye because they're really, really good troublemakers. And when you look at the lives of Peter, James, and John, it's not really clear which ones they are. I mean, you have to remember, Peter had just gotten done rebuking Jesus. Have you ever seen what happens in a classroom when a student rebukes a teacher? It doesn't end well for the student. James and John have the nickname Sons of Thunder for a reason. They have a temper to match the storm clouds that rage over the Sea of Galilee pretty regularly. So I'm more inclined to think that they are the inner circle because they need a little extra guidance than the other 9. Not necessarily that they are really good students and really good listeners. And so they head up onto the mountain for their own little spiritual retreat, and they get up there, and I don't know if they're singing Kumbaya around the fire or what, but as they're in the middle of their retreat, Jesus transforms before them, which would be a really weird thing to see. I can tell you that to see somebody who is dressed in clothes where, they don't wash their clothes every day like we do. They didn't have laundry soap, and they didn't have washing machines and dryers back then. You wore your clothes until they were so dirty you really had to wash them in the river, and there was only so much you could wash out of it. The idea of somebody having bright white clothes was only true for people who were really, really rich or who had a religious role to play inside of the temple, where white robes, which were worn only for special occasions, were necessary and mandatory. And here they see Jesus, who his clothes become so white, it says they're whiter than anyone could ever bleach them. They're whiter than the whitest t-shirt I have, straight out of the bag. And it's like they're glowing, and there's a reason that Mark describes this. There's a reason that Jesus looks like this. It actually ties back into Old Testament prophecies about God himself. If you were to go back to Daniel chapter 7, in verse 9, Daniel has this vision where he sees God on his throne, and God is dressed in white robes that are dazzling white. Now you should take Daniel and tuck it in your back pocket because we'll pull it back out at the end. There's another phrase in Daniel where Daniel, he has this vision where he doesn't just see God on his throne, but he sees one like a son of man coming before God the Father and receiving honor and glory and authority and power over the whole world. And Jesus is going to tap into that at the end of the passage. So you'll kind of keep that in your back pocket. We'll pull it out again in a minute. They don't just see Jesus transfigured to look like God. They see Jesus meeting together with Elijah and Moses, which I think would leave you a little tongue-tied if you're a Jew. Probably would leave me tongue-tied now too, because they've been dead for over 2,000 years. There's two things I want to say about this before we move on to the next part of the passage. First, it's interesting that they see Elijah first and then Moses, which is what Mark mentions. Why would he put Elijah first and not Moses? Because Moses is the older one. You know, Moses is the one who's responsible for the founding of the nation. He's the one who is the lawgiver, the lawbringer. And Elijah came along centuries after Moses. Maybe as much as 1,000 years after Moses. And he was a prophet, probably the quintessential prophet, the greatest prophet that there was. But still a prophet, not the giver of the law. There are no books that Elijah wrote, or if there were, it didn't stick with it, and we don't have anything in the Old Testament he wrote. Whereas Moses is behind the first 5 books of the Bible, are called the books of Moses for a reason. So, why is Elijah first? Well, there is a contextual reason for it. As you continue to read through the passage, what you'll notice is Moses kind of disappears off of this, but they keep talking about Elijah later through the rest of the passage as they get into the role of John the Baptist. You may not have realized it, but the role of Elijah in this is his connection to John the Baptist. The other thing I want to say about why these two people in particular, why not David? Why not Abraham? Why not Isaac? Is because of who these two people represent. Who is Moses? The giver of the law. And he represents the law. Who is Elijah? He is the quintessential prophet. He represents all the prophets. And so here in these two people, meeting with Jesus, you have the law and the prophets represented between both of them. And they represent the entire breadth of all the people of God, going all the way back from Genesis to the end of Chronicles. You might say, well, wait, Chronicles isn't at the end of the Bible. It is in the Jewish Bible. They put their prophets in the middle. The Bible that Jesus read had Chronicles at the end. And Chronicles is included. Kings and Chronicles are included in the prophetic books in the Jewish canon. And so you have the entire Old Testament represented in these two people meeting with Jesus the Messiah. It's not a coincidence that these are the two people here meeting with Jesus. They represent the entire testimony of God's people up until this point, being fulfilled in Jesus and his mission. In fact, Jews from back then, even to this day, when they talk about the Old Testament or their Hebrew Scriptures, they don't call it the Old Testament because they don't believe there's a new one. They refer to the Hebrew Scriptures sometimes as the law and the prophets, and Jesus himself does. If you were to turn to Matthew chapter 22, verse 40, he refers to the entire Old Testament as the law and the prophets. Here you have the entire Old Testament represented standing there with Jesus. And how do the disciples react? Well, let's see. Continuing in verse 5. Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." And it's got in parentheses, he did not know what to say, they were so frightened. Then a cloud appeared and covered them, and a voice came from the cloud. "This is my son, whom I love. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they saw that they were no longer anybody else there with them but Jesus. So here you have Peter, who is so scared that he starts to babble. I mean, these are heroes of the faith. What would you do if they were there right before you? And, I mean, if you had famous people today who are alive today who walked in the door, would you be tongue-tied? mean, I know he's not alive anymore, but if Billy Graham walked through that door, I would probably babble a little bit. Or think about the people that you would like to meet the most. If you actually met them, what would you say? What would you really, not what would you want to say, but what would you actually say? Now, I have to at least give Peter props where he's coherent. I'm not sure I would be. I'm pretty sure my words would fall all over themselves. Now, what he says, it doesn't make a lot of sense in terms of it being kind of a ridiculous thing to say, but at least you can understand what he's saying. But he just babbles to have something to say. Have you ever been there where you're so busy talking, you're actually not listening? I've never done that. Or my personal favorite, have you ever been so busy trying to craft an answer, you're not listening to what the other person is saying? I've never done that either. Don't listen to my wife, she'll always have. She'll tell you the truth, I do that all the time. I don't listen as well as I should, and the disciples, that's exactly where they're at. Is they're not listening to what Jesus is saying. Peter's so busy talking, and they're so scared, their ears are closed. They're so busy and so loud they can't hear what God is going to say through Jesus. And so God has to show up in a cloud to get them to be quiet long enough to actually listen. Now there is some significance in him showing up in the cloud. Both Moses and Elijah had experiences too, where they had theophanies, where God shows up in a cloud on a mountain. And now they've kind of joined that cloud on a mountain club. And Jesus, his Father only says a few words. This is my Son who I love. Listen to him. It's like, Peter, stop talking, sit down, be quiet, and listen. And all the teachers in the room said amen. The cloud clears, and they look up, and it's just Jesus. He's no longer glowing. Moses and Elijah are gone. It's just the old Jesus they knew. The same Jesus who walked up the mountain with them. And yet this image of him glowing like the sun, surrounded by the heroes of the faith, is burned into their memories. Now I would imagine they're like, I can't wait to get back down there and tell Andrew. Oh man, he's going to be sorry he missed this. And Jesus kind of squashes that for them. So let's move into verse 9 here. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus gave them orders not to tell anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. They kept the matter to themselves, discussing what rising from the dead meant. And they asked him, why do the teachers of the law say that Elijah must come first? Jesus replied, to be sure, Elijah does come first and restores all things. Why then is it written that the Son of Man must suffer much and be rejected? But I tell you, Elijah has come, and they have done to him everything they wished, just as it is written about him. So they're coming down the side of the mountain, and Jesus, he kind of tells them, you got to keep a lid on what you've just seen, which I would imagine would... It's a non-disclosure agreement, I guess. But I mean, you just seen this, and Jesus is like, you can't tell anybody. It'd be like if you were to meet the President of the United States and have a one-on-one with him, and he's like, oh, by the way, you can't tell anybody you met me. That would not be fun. And this is someone who's much more important than the President of the United States. This is God revealed in the flesh, glowing like the sun, and the words of God the Father speaking, saying, this is my Son who I love, listen to him. And you can listen, but you can't talk anymore. And Jesus says, you have to wait till after the Son of Man rises from the dead. Now he said Son of Man about himself enough they understand he's talking about himself. It's actually the most common phrase he uses in the entire New Testament for himself. Do you know that Jesus almost never refers to himself as the Son of God? Other people do, God does, but Jesus almost always calls himself Son of Man. Why? Part of it is to emphasize that he really is a human being, but part of it is to connect him to this passage of Daniel. Let's pull Daniel back out. Jesus is the Son of Man who approaches God's throne and is given power and authority and rulership over everything. And the disciples, they can understand that. They can connect that to the Messiah. What they can't get is why on earth the Son of Man would die in the first place. They believe in a resurrection from the dead. The Pharisees taught that. They taught that one day when the Messiah comes, the dead would rise. But the idea that the Messiah himself would have to die and then rise is alien to them. They don't know what to do with it. It doesn't fit in their worldview of who the Messiah is and what the Messiah is supposed to do. Of course, they've heard Jesus talk about dying already, and they're kind of tired of talking to him about it. And so what